No one in the ballroom understood why the Duke stopped walking. He had passed the most beautiful women in England. He had passed white silk, diamonds, practiced curtsies, and smiles that had been arranged in mirrors for weeks. He had passed mothers who watched him over the edges of ivory fans, fathers pretending not to calculate dowries, and daughters whose names had been polished by generations of careful marriages. He had even passed Lady Beatrice Ashcombe. Everyone had expected him to choose her. Beatrice stood near the center of the winter ballroom in a gown white as fresh snow, with pearls sewn along her bodice and a diamond comb trembling in her golden hair. She had been placed beneath the largest chandelier as though the house itself were presenting her to him. Her mother had made certain of it. But the Duke did not look at Beatrice. He looked at the young woman standing near the wine table, holding a silver tray with both hands. She wore the black dress of a servant. For one strange moment, the ballroom became so quiet that Eleanor Vale could hear the faint touch of crystal against crystal on the tray in her hands. She thought the Duke wanted a glass of wine. She lifted the tray a little, as any trained servant would, but he did not reach for a glass. His eyes lowered to her wrist, only for a second, so quickly no one else in the ballroom noticed it. Eleanor noticed. She felt the place he had looked at before she understood why. Beneath the cuff of her plain black sleeve was a small pale scar, hardly longer than the width of a ribbon. It had been there since childhood. She had no memory of earning it, only a memory of smoke. If memory was the word for something that came to her in fragments whenever candlelight shook against a wall. The Duke's face changed, not enough for the room to call it shock, not enough for anyone to accuse him of weakness, but enough for Eleanor to feel, deep in the cold center of herself, that this man had recognized something she had never been allowed to know. Then, before the entire nobility of the county, the Duke of Wycliffe bowed, not to Lady Beatrice, not to a young woman in white satin, to the servant holding the wine tray. He bowed as though she were the highest-born woman in the room, and he said very calmly, "May I have this dance, my lady?" A laugh broke out behind a fan, then another. The sound moved across the ballroom like a crack running through thin ice. Eleanor stood still in the candlelight, the tray suddenly heavy in her hands, while every eye in Ashcombe House turned toward her as though she had become a joke set in the middle of the floor. Only the Duke was not laughing. He remained bowed before her, as if he knew exactly what he was doing, as if the mistake in that room was not that he had chosen a servant, but that no one else had recognized her. The winter ball at Ashcombe House had been planned like a campaign. For 3 weeks, the servants had polished silver until their fingers cracked from the cold water. Wax had been melted into every chandelier. Pine boughs had been twisted around the banisters. The ballroom floor had been rubbed until it reflected candlelight like frozen water. Lady Ashcombe had walked through the house each morning with a list in one hand and displeasure in the other. She was not old, but she had made herself severe. Her dark hair was always pinned too tightly. Her gowns were always cut to suggest mourning without ever surrendering to it. She had married Lord Ashcombe after his first wife died, and after Lord Ashcombe himself was gone, she remained in the house as though widowhood had turned her into stone. The servants feared her. Eleanor had learned to fear her quietly. There were many kinds of cruelty in a great house. Some came with raised voices, some came with locked cupboards, missing wages, cold bedrooms, and instructions delivered in front of other people so that humiliation became part of the work. Lady Ashcombe preferred the second kind. She rarely shouted. She did not need to. Eleanor had grown up beneath that silence. She had been told she was fortunate to have a roof, fortunate to have bread, fortunate that Lady Ashcombe had allowed her to remain at Ashcombe House after the death of the kind woman who had once taken pity on her. That was how the story had always been told. Eleanor had been an orphan. The late Lady Ashcombe, the first wife, had found her half frozen on a roadside after a fire in a nearby village and had taken her in out of charity. When the lady died, her husband had not had the heart to throw the child away. After his death, Lady Ashcombe had kept the young woman on as a servant, a sentimental story, a useful story, a story that made every kindness sound like a debt Eleanor could never repay. So Eleanor learned not to ask questions. She learned to lower her eyes. She learned where to stand in rooms so that no guest would look at her too long. She learned to carry wine without spilling it, to mend lace without tearing it, to vanish when laughter began. She was good at vanishing. That night, she had been ordered to serve in the ballroom because the house was short of footmen, and Lady Ashcombe wanted every corner of the room watched. Eleanor had known what that meant. If a candle guttered, she would be blamed. If a glass broke, she would be blamed. If a guest complained, she would be blamed. And if Lady Beatrice failed to secure the Duke's attention, somehow, in some way Eleanor could not yet imagine, she would be blamed for that too. Lady Beatrice had spent the afternoon in a cloud of perfume, lace, and irritation. From the corridor outside her chamber, Eleanor had heard the rustle of satin, the snap of commands, the small, sharp sounds of a maid being corrected for pins placed too loosely or curls arranged too low. Beatrice was beautiful. No honest person could deny it, but her beauty had been fed with expectation until it had become something brittle. She had been raised to believe the world was a mirror, and if the reflection displeased her, the fault belonged to the glass. Her mother had promised her the Duke, not in words perhaps. Lady Ashcombe was too careful for promises spoken where servants could hear, but the whole household knew it. The Duke of Wycliffe was unmarried, wealthy, powerful, and rumored to be cold enough to make prudence look like romance. He had declined every invitation for years. Now he had accepted Lady Ashcombe's winter ball. That meant something. Everyone said so. The county whispered that he had come to choose a bride. Lady Ashcombe behaved as though the choice had already been made. Eleanor had never seen the Duke before that night. She had heard his name in kitchens and corridors, always spoken with the weight people gave to men who could change lives without raising their voices. Some called him arrogant, some called him honorable. Some said he had inherited Wycliffe too young and trusted no one. Some said he had spent years fulfilling a promise made to a dying friend. Eleanor had not cared. Dukes belonged to a world above staircases. Servants heard their names, carried their coats, cleaned the rooms after they left, and lived on unchanged. At least, that was what she believed until he crossed the ballroom and stopped in front of her. The music had already begun when he asked for her hand. Eleanor didn't move. The tray trembled once. A drop of red wine slid down the side of a glass and fell onto the silver surface like a dark bead. Across the room, Lady Beatrice's smile vanished. Lady Ashcombe's face did not change at first. That was the most frightening thing about her. Anger in others had heat. Hers had calculation. Her eyes moved from the Duke to Eleanor, then to the tray, then to the watching guests. In those few seconds, Eleanor felt the shape of punishment forming. The Duke straightened. He did not repeat the question. He simply held out his gloved hand. The invitation hung there, impossible and public. Eleanor should have stepped back. She should have remembered her place. She should have said that his grace must be mistaken. But the room was laughing, and there was a strange steadiness in the Duke's eyes, as if he were asking her to trust not kindness, but truth. She set the tray down on the nearest table. The small sound of metal against wood seemed louder than the music. Then she placed her hand in his. A murmur rose. Someone said, "How bold." Someone else said, "How disgraceful." Lady Beatrice whispered something to her mother, and Lady Ashcombe's fingers closed around her fan until the ivory ribs bent. The Duke led Eleanor to the center of the ballroom. She had seen dances all her life from the edges of rooms. She knew the patterns, the turns, the pauses. Servants learned everything by watching. But knowing a dance and standing inside one were not the same thing. The floor seemed too wide. The candles seemed too many. Every face seemed sharpened by judgment. The Duke's hand at her back was steady, not intimate, not possessive, simply protective enough to keep her from stumbling. He guided without displaying that he guided. He gave her the dignity of appearing prepared. That was the first mercy of the night. The second was that he did not speak immediately. He let the music carry them once around the floor. He let the room witness what it wanted to mock. Eleanor felt the heat of her own shame rise into her face, and then slowly harden into something else. She had been looked at before, looked past, looked through, looked down upon, never like this. The Duke looked at her as though she were not an accident in the room, as though she had been expected. Only when the first turn brought them beneath the chandelier did he speak. "Do not look at them," he said. His voice was quiet enough that only she could hear. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed somewhere beyond his shoulder. "I'm trying not to fall." "You are not falling. I'm ruining myself." "No," he said. "They are revealing themselves." The words struck her more deeply than comfort would have done. Comfort might have broken her. This did not. This gave shape to what was happening around her. The laughter was not simply laughter. It was evidence. The Duke turned her through the next measure, and Eleanor caught sight of herself in one of the long mirrors. A servant in black moving through a sea of white gowns. A plain figure at the heart of an impossible scandal. A young woman who looked like she had been dragged into someone else's dream by mistake. Then, in the mirror, she saw the Duke glance at her wrist again. The scar burned beneath her cuff. The music ended. For a moment, no one clapped. Then one older gentleman, perhaps out of confusion or courage, struck his hands together twice. A few others followed. The applause sounded uneven, reluctant, and dangerous. The Duke bowed to Eleanor. She curtsied because her body knew how to obey a room even when her mind had left it. Before she could step away, Lady Ashcombe approached. She moved slowly, smiling for the guests. That smile frightened Eleanor more than rage. "My dear Duke," Lady Ashcombe said, her voice smooth enough for the nearest guest to hear, "you have a generous sense of humor." The Duke looked at her. "I was not joking." The air changed. Eleanor felt it. The whole room felt it. Lady Ashcombe's smile remained, but something behind it went still. "How very unusual," she said. "Truth often is," the Duke replied. He bowed once more, not to Lady Ashcombe, but to Eleanor. Then he turned and walked away, leaving the room with a scandal it did not yet know how to name. The punishment came before midnight. Eleanor was sent from the ballroom to the servants' passage, where the music became muffled behind walls and the laughter seemed to grow teeth. In the kitchen, no one knew whether to look at her or avoid her. Mrs. Bell, the cook, pressed a hand to her mouth. Thomas, the youngest footman, stared as though Eleanor had returned from battle. No one asked what had happened. Everyone knew enough. Lady Ashcombe's summons arrived 10 minutes later. Eleanor found her in the morning room, though it was nowhere near morning. A fire burned too brightly in the grate. Lady Beatrice stood beside the mantel, pale with anger, still dressed in white satin. The contrast made her look less like a bride than a candle about to be blown out. Lady Ashcombe held Eleanor's apron between two fingers, as if the cloth itself offended her. "You understand what you have done," she said. Eleanor stood near the door. "I did not ask him." "No, young women like you rarely ask directly." The words were soft, that made them crueler. Beatrice turned away with a small laugh that was almost a sob. "Everyone saw it." "Yes," Lady Ashcombe said. "Everyone saw a servant forget herself." "Yeah." Eleanor's hands closed at her sides. She had spent years swallowing small injuries because survival often required silence. But something about the ballroom remained inside her. The Duke's steady hand, the room revealing itself, the sense that a hidden door had opened somewhere behind her life. "I did not forget myself," she said. Lady Ashcombe looked at her then, fully. For the first time that night, Eleanor saw not disdain but fear. It lasted less than a breath, then it was gone. "You will leave Ashcombe House tonight." The sentence landed without drama. That was how Lady Ashcombe destroyed things. No shouting, no spectacle, just a decision delivered as if it had always existed. Mrs. Bell would later try to bring Eleanor her cloak. She would be stopped. Thomas would try to slip bread into her bag. The housekeeper would shake her head, terrified. Lady Ashcombe's orders moved faster than pity. By midnight, Eleanor stood in the servants' courtyard with a small bundle in her arms. Snow fell in the dark. Not the soft snow painted on Christmas cards, but hard winter snow that struck skin like ash. The back door closed behind her. A bolt slid into place. For a moment she did not move. Ashcombe House rose behind her, glowing from every window. Music still drifted from the ballroom. Guests were still dancing on the floor she had polished. Beatrice was likely being comforted. Lady Ashcombe was likely explaining that the household had corrected an unfortunate embarrassment. Eleanor had nowhere to go. She had been told for years that she owned nothing. In that moment, standing in thin shoes on frozen stone, she believed it. Then she heard wheels. A carriage rolled into the servants' courtyard, not the front drive. Black lacquer, no crest displayed, lamps low, horses steaming in the cold. The door opened. The Duke of Wycliffe stepped down into the snow. He had changed nothing since the ballroom. Same dark coat, same unreadable expression. But here, away from the chandeliers, he seemed less like a guest and more like a man who had expected the night to become cruel. His gaze moved from Eleanor's face to the bundle in her arms, then to the locked door behind her. "Did she give you a cloak?" he asked. Eleanor almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the question was too human after the violence of being turned out. "No." The Duke removed his own cloak and placed it around her shoulders before she could protest. It was heavy, lined with warmth, and smelled faintly of cold air and cedar. Only then did he speak again. "Come with me." Eleanor looked toward the house. "That would make it worse. It is already worse." "I am a servant." He held the carriage door open. "No, Miss Vale, you are a witness who has been removed from the scene." The word witness made the knight tilt. Eleanor stared at him. The snow caught in his hair and on the shoulders of his coat. He did not look romantic. He looked grim, determined, almost angry, though not with her. "What do you know?" she asked. "Enough to know you cannot stay here." "And not enough to tell me why?" The Duke looked past her toward the dark windows of Ashcombe House. "Not yet." It should not have been enough, but behind Eleanor the door was locked. Before her the carriage waited, and in the ballroom earlier when the whole world laughed, this man had been the only one who did not. So she climbed into the carriage, the Duke followed, the door closed, and Ashcombe House began to recede behind them, bright and merciless in the falling snow. By morning, the scandal had outrun the horses. Before the sun had fully risen, drawing rooms across the county were already awake with it. A duke had danced with a servant had left Ashcombe House in his carriage. Lady Beatrice had been humiliated. Lady Ashcombe had been insulted. And because society preferred cruelty when it came dressed as curiosity, Eleanor was blamed before anyone bothered to ask what the Duke had seen. At Wycliffe House, no one laughed at her. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed. The housekeeper gave her a room with a fire, hot water, and a dark blue dress that did not mark her as anyone's servant. The kindness frightened Eleanor more than she expected. Cruelty had rules. Kindness asked her to imagine a life beyond them. The Duke did not summon her until afternoon. When she entered his library, she found papers spread across a long table, old parish notes, copied signatures, a sealed envelope yellowed with age, and a miniature portrait of a woman with dark hair and grave, tender eyes. Eleanor stopped at the sight of it. She did not know the woman, and yet something inside her moved toward that face as if it had been waiting years for permission. This was Lady Marian Ashcombe, the Duke said, the first Lady Ashcombe. The woman Eleanor had always been told had taken pity on her. She was kind to me, Eleanor said, because that was the story she had been given. Yes, the Duke answered, but she was more than that. He asked whether she remembered the fire. Eleanor remembered smoke in pieces, a woman singing, a wrist burning, someone carrying her through darkness, nothing complete enough to trust, but enough to make her afraid of candles when she was small. The Duke placed the sealed envelope on the table. 15 years before, Lord Ashcombe had sent his father a private letter. If anything happened to his daughter, the Duke's family was to preserve certain documents until the child could be found. The word daughter passed through Eleanor like a bell struck in an empty room. The Duke did not soften the truth. Perhaps he knew that after a life built from lies, softness could feel like another form of deceit. Lord Ashcombe and Lady Marian had a daughter, he said, a child named Eleanor Marian Ashcombe. Eleanor gripped the back of the nearest chair. Not Vale, Ashcombe. Her hand went to her wrist. The Duke saw it. That scar was described in the letter, he said, a burn from the nursery fire. For a while, Eleanor could not speak. A person does not become someone else in one breath. The mind resists. It protects itself. It says no because yes is too large, so she felt anger first. If this is true, why did no one come? The Duke lowered his eyes. My father died before he could act. I found the papers after I inherited Wycliffe. I searched for 3 years. The parish registers had been altered. Servants had vanished. Every trail led back to Ashcombe House, and every answer from Ashcombe House was a lie. He opened the envelope. Inside was half of a will, cut cleanly down the middle. My father was given one half, he said. The other was hidden by your mother. Where? The Duke looked at the portrait of Lady Marian. In the one room Lady Ashcombe never allowed anyone to touch. Eleanor knew before he said it. The music room. The piano she had dusted every Thursday. The piano she had once been slapped for playing as a child. The piano that had stood silent in Ashcombe House for 15 years. Not because no one loved music, but because someone feared what music might remember. Mr. Harrow, an old solicitor with careful eyes, arrived that evening. He examined the letter, the half-will, and the scar on Eleanor's wrist without touching her. Then he said what the Duke had already known. They needed the other half. They needed witnesses, and they needed to force Lady Ashcombe to open the house before she could bury the truth again. That night, Eleanor slept badly. Not because she doubted the Duke, but because belief had begun to grow inside her. Belief hurt more than suspicion. Suspicion kept the heart guarded. Belief opened the door and let grief enter with the cold. By morning, the Duke had sent formal notice for a public reading of Lord Ashcombe's testament at Ashcombe House. He invited legal witnesses, household officers, and several guests who had laughed the loudest in the ballroom. Lady Ashcombe could not refuse without looking guilty, so she agreed. The truth would return to Ashcombe House by the front door. In the 2 days before the reading, the house tried to protect its lie. A frightened maid from Ashcombe arrived at Wycliffe's back gate after dark, carrying a small bundle beneath her shawl. Her name was Alice, and Eleanor remembered sharing bread with her after Lady Ashcombe had punished the kitchen for a broken vase. Alice would not sit until Mrs. Arden locked the door. Only then did she unwrap the bundle. Inside was a faded blue ribbon, smoke-stained at one end. Eleanor touched it, and memory came. Not as a full picture, but as warmth, lavender water, A woman's fingers tying ribbon in her hair, then smoke swallowing the room. Alice whispered that Mrs. Bell had kept it from the old nursery. She also said Lady Ashcombe had locked the music room, placed a footman outside it, and burned papers in her bedroom fire for 2 nights. That was enough. The Duke did not rage. He simply became more still. "She knows where the second half is," he said. "And she will destroy it," Eleanor answered. "Not if the room is full of witnesses." So they moved quickly. Mr. Harrow prepared the legal demand. The Duke prepared the witnesses. Eleanor prepared herself for the hardest thing of all, returning to the house that had taught her to lower her eyes, and standing there without lowering them. The house looked different when Eleanor returned, not smaller, not kinder, but different. The front doors opened for her because she arrived in the Duke's carriage. That alone sent a tremor through the servants lined in the hall. Eleanor stepped down in the dark blue dress Mrs. Arden had altered for her, with her hair pinned simply at the nape of her neck. No jewels, no borrowed grandeur. Only the Duke's steady presence at her side and the faded blue ribbon folded inside her glove. Lady Ashcombe waited at the foot of the stairs. Lady Beatrice stood 1 step above her, dressed in pale gray instead of white. Without the ballroom lights, she looked younger, less triumphant, more frightened. The entrance hall filled slowly. Guests removed gloves and pretended they had not come for blood. Men cleared their throats. Women whispered. The solicitor arranged papers on a long table. Servants stood along the walls, not as decoration, but because Mr. Harrow had insisted that household officers be present. Mrs. Bell was there. Thomas was there. Alice stood near the back, white-faced but determined. Eleanor saw them and understood the cost of their courage. Lady Ashcombe saw Eleanor looking. Her mouth tightened. The Duke leaned slightly toward Eleanor, not touching her. "Stand where you choose," he said. It was a small sentence. It nearly broke her. For years, every place in this house had been assigned to her. Behind chairs, beside doors, below stairs, at the edge of rooms, near enough to serve, never near enough to matter. Now she walked to the center of the hall, not beside the Duke, not behind him, the center. A murmur moved through the gathered guests. Lady Ashcombe smiled. "Very theatrical," she said. Eleanor did not answer. Mr. Harrow began. He explained the matter formally. The existence of a divided testament, the sworn letter preserved by the late Duke of Wycliffe's father, the description of Lord Ashcombe's daughter, the scar, the nursery fire, the unanswered questions surrounding the first Lady Ashcombe's final months. Every sentence tightened the room. Lady Ashcombe remained still. Too still. Then Mr. Harrow requested access to the old music room. "No," Lady Ashcombe said. It was the first unpolished word she had spoken that day. The room heard it. The Duke turned his head. "No?" Lady Ashcombe recovered quickly. "The room is in disrepair. It is unsuitable for guests." Mr. Harrow adjusted his spectacles. "We are not guests at present, my lady. We are witnesses." That sentence changed everything. Lady Ashcombe looked at the faces around her and found no shelter. Curiosity had made them cruel 3 nights before. Now it made them attentive. She had no choice. The procession to the music room felt less like a walk through a house than a passage into the buried part of a life. Eleanor knew the corridor. She had carried coal through it. She had swept ash from its corners. She had once pressed her ear to the music room door after hearing, or imagining she heard, a piano note in the dark. The door was unlocked. The room smelled of dust, cold wax, and old roses. The piano stood near the far wall. It was covered with a white sheet. No one moved. Then Lady Ashcombe stepped forward. Too quickly. The Duke moved faster. He caught her wrist before she could reach the candelabrum on the side table. For 1 second, Eleanor did not understand. Then she saw the flame. Lady Ashcombe had not moved toward the piano to stop them searching it. She had moved toward fire. The same element that had erased a nursery, a mother, and a child's name 15 years before. A gasp rose behind Eleanor. Lady Ashcombe's mask broke. "You know nothing," she hissed. The Duke held her wrist firmly, but without violence. "Then let the piano prove us fools." Mr. Harrow ordered 2 footmen to uncover it. The sheet came away. Dust rose in the candlelight. The piano looked exactly as Eleanor remembered it. Dark wood, ivory keys, a small crack along the left leg, a faint carved rose above the music stand. Mr. Harrow examined the instrument with careful hands. For several minutes, nothing happened. The room began to breathe again. Lady Ashcombe's face regained color. Then Eleanor saw it. The carved rose, not a decoration, a latch. She stepped forward. "May I?" she asked. No one spoke. She touched the rose. It shifted beneath her finger. A narrow panel opened under the music stand. Inside lay a packet wrapped in oilcloth. The room forgot how to move. Mr. Harrow lifted it out as gently as if it were a relic. The oilcloth had darkened with age, but the seal remained. Lady Marian's seal. A rose and a crescent moon. Eleanor knew it from the miniature portrait. The same mark had been painted in the corner of the frame. Mr. Harrow broke the seal. Inside was the missing half of the will and a letter. Not from Lord Ashcombe, from Marian. Mr. Harrow looked at Eleanor. "This is addressed to my daughter." The words were too intimate for the room. Eleanor wanted everyone to leave. She wanted no one to leave. Her hands shook once, then steadied. "Read the will first," she said. Lady Ashcombe made a sound like disbelief, but Eleanor did not look at her. Mr. Harrow joined the two halves of the document on the piano lid. The torn edges matched perfectly. Then he read. Lord Ashcombe's legal language was dense, cautious, and wounded by guilt. It named his daughter, Eleanor Marian Ashcombe, as the sole legitimate heir to Ashcombe House and its principal lands. It stated that if the child were hidden, misnamed, or raised under another identity, all protections and inheritances remained intact until her discovery. It named the late Duke of Wycliffe's line as guardians of the proof. It named the scar on the left wrist. It named the blue ribbon kept by the child's mother. It named, carefully and without ornament, the possibility of betrayal within the household. By the time Mr. Harrow finished, the room was no longer merely listening. It was ashamed. Not everyone. Some people are never ashamed. They are only inconvenienced. But many had laughed in the ballroom. Many had whispered. Many had enjoyed seeing a servant humiliated because it cost them nothing. Now the cost stood before them in a blue dress, with no jewels, no tears, and a name the house had tried to bury. Lady Beatrice sat down suddenly on the nearest chair. Her face was empty. Lady Ashcombe did not sit. She stared at the will as though hatred alone might turn ink to ash. "It is false," she said. Mr. Harrow folded the paper. "It is witnessed, sealed, and now complete. She is a servant." The words fell flat. For years that sentence had been a weapon. Now it sounded like a person insisting the sun had not risen because they preferred the dark. Eleanor looked at Lady Ashcombe. For the first time in her life she saw the woman clearly, not as a giant, not as fate. A woman who had stolen a child's place and then spent 15 years terrified the child would stand up. Eleanor did not shout. That would have been too easy. She walked to the piano and placed her hand on the dark wood. The same piano she had been forbidden to touch. The same piano that had kept her mother's secret more faithfully than the living had. Then she said, "You made me dust this every Thursday." No one expected that. The sentence was not grand. It was not legal. It was devastating because it carried the weight of ordinary years. "You made me clean the room where my mother hid my name," Eleanor continued. "You made me polish the keys that held my father's will. You watched me kneel beside the thing that could have freed me, and you said nothing." Lady Ashcombe's face twisted. "You would have ruined everything." "No," Eleanor said. "I would have existed." The room went silent. The Duke looked at her then, and for the first time his restraint seemed close to breaking. Not into romance, not yet, into admiration. But Eleanor was not finished. She turned away from Lady Ashcombe and looked toward the servants gathered near the door. Mrs. Bell was crying openly now. Thomas had both fists closed at his sides. Alice stood very still. Eleanor understood that ownership was not simply paper. It was responsibility. It was the power to become exactly what had harmed her, or to end it. She walked out of this music room. The guests followed because they could not help themselves. Back in the entrance hall, Eleanor climbed the main staircase. Every step remembered her knees. Every polished rail remembered her hands. She reached the landing and turned. Below her stood Lady Ashcombe, Lady Beatrice, the Duke, the solicitor, the guests, and the servants of Ashcombe House. For years, Eleanor had looked up from the bottom of those stairs. Now they looked up at her. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "No one who is kind to me will lose their place." The words moved through the hall like warmth entering a frozen room. Mrs. Bell covered her face. Alice began to cry. Thomas looked at the floor because young men do not always know what to do when justice arrives quietly. Eleanor looked at Lady Ashcombe next, but no one who used this house to hide cruelty will command it again. Lady Ashcombe's composure finally failed, not with a scream, with something smaller, a collapse inward. The understanding that the walls she had ruled from now belonged to the young woman she had tried to erase. Mr. Harrow stepped forward to speak of legal transitions, trusteeship, formal claims, and protections. The guests began whispering again, but the tone had changed. Scandal had become history while they were still standing in the room. The Duke remained at the foot of the stairs. He did not look triumphant. That mattered to Eleanor. He had not come to rescue a helpless young woman for the pleasure of being admired. He had come to keep faith with the dead, and perhaps with something in himself that could not tolerate a lie left undisturbed. When the hall began to empty, he waited until Eleanor descended. Only then did he approach. "You have your house," he said. The words were simple. Impossible. Eleanor looked past him to the open doors, the servants, the fading light, the rooms that were hers and not yet hers at all. "I do not know how to be its mistress. No one worth trusting begins by knowing how to rule." She almost smiled. "Is that advice from a duke?" "It is advice from a man who inherited too young and made several mistakes before breakfast." It was the first time she had heard humor in his voice. Very faint, almost hidden. It changed his face. For one moment, the Duke of Wycliffe looked less like a title and more like a man. Then his expression grew serious again. "There will be pressure," he said. "People will advise you to marry quickly, to let a husband manage the estate, to forgive publicly what should be judged privately, to be grateful enough that you become obedient." Eleanor understood the warning beneath the warning. "And you?" she asked. The Duke held her gaze. "I will advise you to do none of those things." Outside, the snow had stopped. Through the open door, the world looked pale and newly made. "You brought me here," Eleanor said. "I brought you to the truth. What you do with it must be yours." That was the moment Eleanor began to trust him fully, not because he had chosen her in the ballroom, not because he had wrapped her in his cloak, not because he had found the will, but because now that he could have claimed a place in her future, he stepped back and gave it to her. The months that followed were not beautiful in the way songs make justice beautiful. They were full of ledgers, repairs, legal petitions, unpaid wages, hidden debts, and relatives who had ignored Eleanor for years, but suddenly wrote to advise her future. Inheritance did not arrive as a crown. It arrived as keys, accounts, leaking roofs, and people waiting to see whether the servant young woman would fail at being a lady. Eleanor did not fail. She listened first to the people no one else had listened to. Mrs. Bell was given real authority over the kitchens. Thomas was trained under the steward. Alice was moved to the still room, where her careful hands and quiet mind were finally valued. The tenants discovered that the new mistress of Ashcombe knew more about broken gates, damp walls, and winter stores than half the gentlemen who had offered to manage her affairs. Lady Ashcombe left under legal disgrace before spring. Lady Beatrice stayed for a time, stripped of certainty and too proud to ask for pity. One morning she came to Eleanor's study and said, without decoration, that she had hated her because she thought Eleanor had taken something meant for her. Eleanor looked at the pale young woman before her and saw not innocence, but ruin shaped by another woman's ambition. She did not embrace her. She did not call her sister. But she allowed Beatrice to remain until she had somewhere to go. That was not forgiveness. It was mercy with a door behind it. The Duke visited rarely enough to silence half the gossip, and often enough to steady the parts of Eleanor's life that still shook. He brought documents, advice, and books on estate management with dry notes in the margins. He never treated her house as his future property. He never asked for gratitude to become affection. That was why affection came anyway, slowly, safely, like a fire built in a room that had been cold for years. In the ruined garden near the old nursery wing, Eleanor finally allowed him to call her by her name. "Not Miss Ashcombe, not my lady. Eleanor." He received the permission as though it mattered more than any title. And because he did not hurry her, she began to imagine a future in which love did not feel like another form of being chosen by someone else. A year after the winter ball, Ashcombe House opened its doors again. Not for Lady Beatrice, not for Lady Ashcombe, for Eleanor. The invitation had been simple. A winter assembly in honor of the tenants, neighbors, and households of Ashcombe. Music, supper, and dancing. No display of conquest, no announcement of revenge. But everyone understood that the night mattered. The last time the ballroom had glittered, Eleanor had stood beside the wine table in a servant's dress. Now she stood at the top of the staircase while guests arrived below. The house had changed, not in obvious ways. The chandeliers were the same. The mirrors still caught the candlelight. The floor still shone. But the air was different. Servants moved without flinching. Fires burned in rooms that had once been kept cold to save appearances. The music room was open and the piano had been tuned. On the wall near the entrance hall hung Lady Marian's portrait, not hidden in a private corridor, not tucked away like a grief too inconvenient for company, in the open. Beneath it, in a small frame, was the blue ribbon. Some guests found that sentimental, some found it unsettling. Eleanor found it necessary. She wore a gown of deep green silk, not white. She had no desire to look like the young woman who had once waited to be chosen. Her hair was pinned with a simple pearl comb that had belonged to her mother. Around her left wrist, she wore no bracelet. The scar remained visible. Let them see it. Let them wonder. Let them remember. Mrs. Bell supervised the supper with the authority of a general. Thomas, now assistant to the steward, stood near the side doors trying and failing to look dignified. Alice carried flowers to the music room and blushed whenever anyone praised the arrangements. Eleanor watched them and felt something warmer than triumph. Belonging, perhaps. Not the belonging she had once begged from the house. The belonging she had built inside it. Then the Duke arrived. For a moment the room seemed to repeat itself. Conversation softened, fans paused, heads turned. Adrian Wycliffe entered in black evening dress, composed as ever, with winter in his hair and restraint in every line of him. A year ago, every unmarried woman had wondered whom he would choose. Tonight, no one wondered. They looked at Eleanor, then at him, then back again. The first dance began to gather around the edges of the room. Musicians lifted their bows. Guests waited with the old hunger for a public sign. The Duke did not move toward Eleanor. He stood near the doorway and bowed from a distance, leaving the choice where he had always insisted it belonged, with her. Eleanor descended the staircase. Every step felt different this time, not because the past had vanished, it had not. The wood remembered, so did she. But memory no longer held her down. It rose beneath her like a foundation. She crossed the ballroom. She passed white gowns. She passed diamonds. She passed women who had laughed and now smiled too carefully. She stopped before the Duke of Wycliffe. For one breath, he looked exactly as he had on the night he changed her life. Still, watchful, waiting. Then Eleanor bowed her head just enough to make the room lean in. "May I have this dance, Your Grace?" The silence that followed was not mockery this time. It was recognition. The Duke's face changed, not enough for the room to call it joy, enough for Eleanor. He bowed to her. "As my lady wishes." She placed her hand in his. The music began. And this time, when Eleanor moved through the ballroom, no one laughed. They watched the woman they had mistaken for a servant dance in the house that had carried her name all along. But Eleanor was not thinking of them. She was thinking of the first night, the silver tray, the cold weight of shame, the scar he had noticed when no one else saw her at all. She was thinking of snow outside a locked door, of a cloak around her shoulders, of a piano holding a dead woman's truth, of a staircase climbed at last without permission, and of the man who had not asked her to become his answer before she had become her own. Halfway through the dance, the Duke spoke quietly. "You know what they expect now." Eleanor looked at the room over his shoulder. "Yes." "And?" She looked back at him. "They may wait." Something like laughter touched his eyes. "For how long?" Eleanor let the music turn them beneath the chandelier. For once, the light did not feel like judgment. It felt like mourning. "Until I decide," she said. The Duke accepted that, as if it were the only answer he had ever wanted. And perhaps that was why, when love finally came fully into the room between them, it did not feel like rescue. It felt like freedom choosing to stay. Outside, snow began to fall again over Ashcombe House. Inside, the candles burned steady. The piano waited in the open music room. The servants smiled without fear. The guests whispered, of course, because society would always whisper. But whispers could no longer decide who Eleanor was. Not after the scar, not after the will, not after the house itself had given back her name. She had once carried wine through that ballroom with trembling hands, invisible to everyone except the one man who knew where to look. Now she crossed the same floor as its mistress. Not chosen, recognized. And at Ashcombe House, that made all the difference.